Good morning once again. So glad you are here. Welcome again to Radiant. I just want to take a moment and just thank not only the worship team, but thanking every single person who makes this happen every single Sunday. We truly do kind of church in the box where we set up and tear down this thing every single week. And so can we just thank our setup and tear down crew really quick? Thank you so much for making this happen. You are so appreciated. Well, hey, I want to dive on in today, and I want to tell you a story. Back in 2007, I was just about to complete my very first semester of college. I was completing my first semester, and my first semester of college took place right here, actually. It took place on DMACC Ankeny campus. This was my very first exposure to college, and at the time, me and my cousin, we were kind of like best friends at the time, we were always hanging out together, and we decided, hey, what if we took a bunch of DMACC classes together? We were always at each other's houses anyway, we were hanging out, and so we said, hey, that's a great idea, and we got through the semester, and we were feeling pretty good about ourselves, somehow got through the semester, I should say, but we got to the end, and it was time to look at our final grades. Grades were having to be submitted, all your work was having to be turned in, because in 24 hours, the final grades would be posted. And I remember we were both looking at, how we did throughout the semester, and I was feeling pretty good about myself. I'd made it through, big sigh of relief, and my cousin was, looking through his grades, and all of a sudden, he stopped, and he realized something. And he looked at me, and he said, I have a 0% in criminology. And then he said, I didn't even realize I had signed up for criminology. He had signed up for an entire course that he hadn't attended a single time, an online course, criminology. He had no idea that he had paid and signed up and now had a big fat 0 on his transcript for this class. Talk about panic, right? I remember in that moment I was just like, well, that stinks, what are you going to do? And I'm like, well, maybe you can go talk to the administration. Maybe they'll wipe it off your transcript or at least give you your money back. I'm trying to give them the options and trying to help them work through it, trying to encourage them a little bit. But meanwhile, I'm just glad to be done, And I'll never forget what happens next. He looks at me and he says, well, time to get to work. What? Time to get to work? What do you mean? He's like, time to get to work. And sure enough, I'm like, what are you talking about? What do you mean time to get to work? He's like, I got to do this class in less than 24 hours. I'm like, no way, like this is a college class. No way you're going to be able to do that. He's like, watch me, right? And he goes to work. And I kid you not, in 18 hours, my cousin goes from a 0%. He completes 18 quizzes, 6 tests, a midterm, and a final in 18 hours time and ends up with a B+ in the class, okay? Amazing, right? I have anxiety just talking about this here today. You know what I'm saying? Like, the whole time he was working and typing this out and completing these quizzes online, the whole time I'm just heckling him. I'm like, dude, just give up. No way you're going to do this. No way at all. And he thrived under that pressure. And now the joke's on me because to this day, I still have a reoccurring nightmare where I forgot a college course, okay? And he doesn't. He sleeps just fine. But anyway, all that to say, it wasn't that my cousin was super smart. He's a smart guy, but it was not that he was super smart. He just thrives under pressure. You know what I'm saying? You know anyone like that in your life where they thrive when the going gets tough? Here and today, whether it's at your job or whether it's just living or whether it's with kids, family, relationships, oftentimes there are all sorts of pressures that we feel closing in around us. And today in society, I think also we feel a similar sort of pressure kind of closing in around us, not because of time, but as Christians living today, it can kind of feel like society is sort of turning its mind, changing its mind and turning its back a little bit on us as believers. It feels like there's more pressure on us today more than there has in a long time. And the question I want to ask today is, how can we as believers thrive under the pressure of our culture here today? How can we not just hunker down and survive, but how can we thrive when the pressure is on and the going gets tough? We're going to be continuing on in our series today called Yearbook. Actually, it's our final week of our Yearbook series. Have you guys been enjoying this? Hopefully you have, as we've been walking through the Bible, looking at different Bible characters. And today, our final Bible character is his name, Daniel. And Daniel is a really special character. And so today we are giving Daniel the award. The votes are in. We're giving Daniel the award most likely to thrive under pressure. Now, the story of Daniel begins, or the book of Bible begins in 589 BC. What happens is the Babylonian Empire is taking over the city of Jerusalem. So they besiege the city and they ransack it. They take things out of the temple for themselves. And not only do they take things, but they also take people from Jerusalem. They take some of the Jews. And what happens is the Babylonians, they take for themselves some of the smartest, some of the most handsome, some of the most teachable, the able-bodied men, right? Bring anyone to mind, right? Yes, I'm talking about Pastor Luke, okay? They take some of these men for themselves, okay? And they take the best and the brightest and the most royal family, and they are meant to train them up to be servants in the Babylonian Empire. Now, to give you a little bit of glimpse in the Babylonian Empire, this is sort of the worst of the worst as far as it comes to culture. This is evil beyond evil. In fact, in the Bible, the Bible treats Babylon as sort of the personification of evil. There is all sorts of problems going on with sexual immorality. There's the occult happening. There's astrology. There's magicians. There's all sorts of mythologies. They are worshiping demons and false gods. There's all sorts of nasty things happening in the Babylonian culture. Now, can you imagine for a moment for Daniel and his friends, these people who are kind of good Jewish young men, being taken from their home into captivity, into a foreign land, and then having to be in a culture like that? Can you imagine the culture shock, right? I remember when I went to Haiti, just seeing the different culture and seeing the thing around me, there was a very real culture shock. Maybe some have experienced that. Can you imagine what that must have felt like? To be exposed to all these wicked, horrible ideologies. And this is where Daniel and his friends find themselves. They feel the pressure of the culture around them. And they're told to learn the language and learn the customs, to wear the clothing and to eat the food. They are feeling the pressure of the evil around them, the culture around them. Sometimes I look at the world, and as believers, we can too feel that pressure closing in around us. We look at headlines like this one, whereas Christians under attack worldwide at a rapidly rising rate. We're seeing more and more hostility against the people who follow Jesus, and we're seeing attacks happen, especially on Christian holidays, and it seems to be an ever-increasing rising rate. The heat has been turned up, and the pressure is on. Now, for us, we know that this is no mystery for us. In fact, Jesus himself told us this would happen in John 15. It says, if you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you. The world hates us because we've been chosen out of the world to be different, to look different. There's 3 stories today. Real quick, I want to walk through Daniel. You may have heard them, maybe growing up in church, or maybe you've heard these stories, but we don't have a ton of time, but I want to really quick highlight a few stories from Daniel here today. You see, once Daniel and his friends were captured, one of the first things they tried to do is they tried to strip away their Jewish identity and turn them into Babylonians. They had to walk the walk. They tried to get them to eat the food. And one of the things that they tried to get Daniel and his friends to do was to eat the food and the wine of the royal court. The only problem was that for Daniel and his friends, the things that they were trying to get them to eat was not kosher, right? It went against their customs. It went against God and who they were. And so Daniel does something. He stands up for what's right. Daniel 1:8, it says this. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with royal food and with wine. And he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. And the chief official, he's like, no way I can let that happen. You're gonna wither and you're gonna become weak, and that's not gonna work out for me. And Daniel says, just test me on this. Give me 10 days. In 10 days, we're gonna eat pretty much just vegetables, and I promise you that we're gonna look better than all the other men who eat whatever they want. But we don't want to defile ourselves. Daniel stands up for God in this way. And sure enough, it pays off. 10 days later, they look better and healthier than all the other men. because they chose to honor God even with their diet. That's like the true miracle of the story, somehow like eating only vegetables and then like still like thriving, okay? I don't know how people do that, but they made it work, okay? And Daniel stands up here and he says, we cannot defile ourselves in this way. Test me on this. And people are able to see who God is through this. There's another story, skip ahead into chapter 3, story of 3 of Daniel's friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Growing up, I knew them as Radshak and Benny from VeggieTales, okay? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And what they are faced with is the king at the time, Nebuchadnezzar. He erects a statue of himself, a golden statue, and he says, you know what? When the trumpets sound, I want everyone to bow down and worship me and worship my gods. This proposes a problem for the 3 friends of Daniel who worship the one true living God. They have a problem with bowing down before other gods. It's in the law. It's in the Torah. So sure enough, as the rest of culture is bowing down, these 3 men stand up for what's right. Stand up for God. When they're confronted by Nebuchadnezzar, I love their response. They're essentially look at Nebuchadnezzar and they say, we cannot do this. We have to follow God here. And we understand that you may need to throw us in the fiery furnace as punishment, and even if you do, God will save us. And then they also say, even if God doesn't save us, that's okay too, essentially, because they have no choice. They have to stand for what's right, even when everyone else is bowing down. And the rest of the story, we know they're thrown into the fiery furnace. And it's not just those 3, but all of a sudden a 4th man in the fire turns up, one who's described as being the Son of God. Scholars believe that perhaps even Jesus Christ himself, before even the New Testament, was there rescuing those men in the fire. And because those 3 men stood up for what was right, stood up for what they believed in, the evil men around them were able to get a clear glimpse into who God was. They were able to see Jesus. They led with conviction. The story, the final story, real quick. We've heard this one before, Daniel in the lion's den. Maybe you've heard that growing up. But it's found in Daniel 6. And there's a new king at this time. His name's Darius. And some wise men around Darius who are concerned with being in power, they say, hey, let's make a law where basically you can only worship and pray to certain gods. Basically, they're trying to trap Daniel. And they knew that the only way to trap Daniel was not to catch him doing something wrong, but was to catch him doing something right? Worshiping his God. And so they set up a rule that says, hey, no one's allowed to pray essentially to any other gods, because they knew that this would happen. Daniel 6:10, we read this about Daniel. It says, 3 times a day, Daniel got down on his knees and he prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Even though the law was against it, he knew that he had no other choice but to worship his God. Are you sensing a pattern here in these 3 stories? And I love this line. I don't want us to miss this here before. He was giving thanks to God, praying to God, just as he had done before. It's not like because all of a sudden there was a new law that Daniel was all of a sudden trying to show him who's boss and pray to God. This was a regular routine practice for Daniel. He had a pattern in his life of godliness, of standing up for who God was in his ways. Here's what's important, church. It's easier to stand up for God publicly if you're practicing godliness privately, right? It's easier to stand up when the going gets tough for God and speak out and stand firm and where you are when you're already practicing godliness in your private life. How many Christians do we see publicly proclaiming and yelling and publicly proclaiming truth? Well, you got to wonder in their private life, is it really matching up? Private godliness as well. It's a good question for us. In our lives, are we looking any different than the culture around us? Like really? Are there things about our culture that are appealing to us? When the going gets tough, it helps to know that you've had practice. I had a buddy And my buddy signed up to do the Des Moines Half Marathon or Dam to Dam or one of those two. Anyway, it was like 12, whatever it is, 13 miles that you're supposed to run on these marathons. I've never done it. I don't know, okay? Never will, okay? But he signed up to do this run, and the problem was he didn't practice running like hardly at all. He had maybe gone out a few times, and I don't think he'd ever gone the full distance, but he said, it'll be fine. When it comes to race day, I'll make it happen, right? And I got to tell you, it was so funny to hear him tell the story of this race and just how brutal it was for him. I think he almost died, right? Because he had no practice. He hadn't been doing it, so when it came to race day, he struggled hard. It's easier to stand up for God publicly if we've been practicing godliness privately. Now, for us as believers here today in this room, it's tempting to just kind of land here and just say, all right, church, go out and stand up for what's right. Go out, be loud, be proud, go out and fight for truth, right? It's tempting to land there and say, all right, now go and do it. But I think there's a tension that we need to wrestle with as believers, especially here in our culture today, in this day and age. See, today, it seems like there's not a whole lot of actual conversation going and taking place in our culture. It seems like when people believe they're standing up for what's right, what they're really doing is shouting truth as loud as they can at the other side. And we see this all the time. We see an increase in polarization, be it on the 24-hour news cycle or on social media. What we're seeing is that people, even Christians, are sometimes guilty of standing up and being red in face and harsh in tone, standing up for God's truth. But what comes out is actually just noise sometimes. It's not just believers on both sides of the spectrum. Both sides are getting dug in deeper and deeper. It's like a modern-day trench warfare, you know? We're going to hunker down in our trench, and we're going to call in artillery strikes on the other side. No real conversation going place. You should see the statistics about how we more and more Americans are demonizing, right? Calling the other side of the political aisle evil more and more and more in increased rates. And we're seeing this across the board. So I'm hesitant to just be like, all right, Christians, go out and stand up for what's truth, because I don't want us to miss something. I don't want us to miss how Daniel stood up for truth. You see, I believe that the secret to Daniel thriving under the pressure that he was in, the cultural pressure he was in, the secret to Daniel blooming where he was planted, so to speak, was that while Daniel stood strong in his convictions, he did so with compassion. He did so with compassion. Let me show you what I mean here. Throughout the book of Daniel, because Daniel chose to not eat the food that was not lawful and to drink the wine sacrificed to idols, because he chose to stand for God in that moment, God rewarded him with the ability to interpret dreams. Kind of a weird thing that we don't see too often, but the ability to interpret prophetic dreams that God had given people. So the ruler at the time, Nebuchadnezzar, there's a couple instances in which he has a dream that he needs interpreting. And so being the Babylonian culture, right, where they're into mysticism and the occult and they're into astrology, Nebuchadnezzar brings around him the Babylonian wise men to interpret the dream. The only problem is they're all frauds, right? And they're unable to interpret the dream. And so Nebuchadnezzar starts to get mad at his wise men, and he issues a decree to kill all the wise men of Babylon for failing him. Maybe Nebuchadnezzar's starting to, his worldview's kind of unraveling a little bit, starting to realize he's believed in some things that aren't true. And he issues a decree to kill everyone, all the wise men. And Daniel decides to step in at a pivotal moment. Take a look at Daniel 2, verse 14. Then Daniel replied with prudence and discretion. Can we pause for a second? How much does our culture need a little bit of prudence and discretion, right? Daniel replies with prudence and discretion to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon, these evil men. Daniel 2:24. Daniel went and said thus to him. Sense the compassion here. He says, do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Bring me in before the king, and I will show the king the interpretation. Here we see a picture of Daniel sticking out his neck before the king, willing to risk even his own life for the safety of his friends. Yes, but also for the safety and to spare his enemies. These wise men who believed in their demonic pagan gods, the gods that had failed them before Nebuchadnezzar. If it were me in this situation, I would be tempted, if I was Daniel, to be like, well, what'd you think was going to happen, right? Your pagan gods have failed you. They are void. They are false. It would be tempting if I was Daniel to be like, you dug your own grave, now lie in it. Instead, Daniel doesn't do that. With compassion, he sticks his own neck, his own life on the line to save not only his friends, but even to save his enemies. Daniel expresses compassion. A second time that this happens, Nebuchadnezzar has a second dream, and essentially the dream, God is trying to get across to Nebuchadnezzar judgment. He's saying, because of your pride and because you haven't followed me, I'm going to chop you down, and you're not going to rule anymore. Nebuchadnezzar doesn't like this. Okay, this is really bad news to him. But check out Daniel's response in lieu of this judgment against this evil Nebuchadnezzar. It says in Daniel 4:19, then Daniel, also called Belteshazzar, was greatly perplexed for a time, and his thoughts terrified him. So the king Nebuchadnezzar said, Belteshazzar, do not let the dream or its meaning alarm you. Daniel answered, my lord, if only the dream applied to your enemies and its meaning to your adversaries. Again, if I was Daniel in this moment, and I'm finally in a position where God is issuing and ushering out his judgment against this evil king. If I was Daniel in this position, I'd be like, you're getting everything you deserved here, Nebuchadnezzar. You're getting everything you deserve here. Finally, you will see that the one true God reigns. But instead, Daniel looks at this evil king and he says, I don't wish this upon you. I wish this was for your enemies. Daniel has compassion. What we see here is that Daniel's showing compassion even to the enemies of God. He's showing compassion even to those who speak against God. In every single interaction, we see Daniel handling himself with humility. Larry Osborne, in his book, Thriving in Babylon, writes it this way, and I love the way he puts this. He writes, Nebuchadnezzar was as evil as they come. He served a demonic god. He trashed Jerusalem and God's temple. He mocked God. He was unreasonable, hot-headed, vain, murderous, and cruel. Yet every interaction Daniel had with him was respectful and gracious. He understood that every time we treat God's enemies as our enemies, we harden their hearts and build up a wall that makes repentance all the more unlikely. Every time we look at the enemies of God and we cast out judgment without having tears and compassion in our eyes, we build up a wall which makes repentance all the more difficult. Daniel knew something. He knew that we worship a God who doesn't want anyone to perish, but he wants all to come to a saving relationship with Jesus Christ. Many of us here today, Daniel chose to serve well, serve this evil empire and this evil king, but he chose to do it well so that he could grow in influence. Some of us here today, maybe you feel like you're serving an evil empire in many ways, right? Maybe it's whether your government or maybe in your workplace, right? Maybe as I'm describing Nebuchadnezzar, you're like, oh, that sounds like my boss, okay, right? Maybe for some of you, you feel like you are in an environment that is toxic and evil, and you're not quite sure if you should be there. In Daniel, when the pressure is on, when the evil's caving in around him, what does he choose to do? He doesn't choose to just say and just be rebellious and say, to heck with you guys. I hope God wipes you all out. Instead, Daniel chooses to serve and serve well. He does it with compassion. He does it with humility. I think Daniel understood something. You see, Daniel was more concerned with winning God's enemies over, not wiping them out. Daniel was concerned with winning God's enemies over, not just wiping them out. His heart, I think what we see a little bit, his heart broke for their lostness. It reminds me of when Jesus looked out over Jerusalem, this city who had denied him, the city who had turned their back against him, and we see a glimpse of Jesus' compassion for a whole city, for the culture around him. We see this in Matthew 23. This is what Jesus says. He says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it." It's pretty harsh. Jesus says this, "How often I would have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing." We see Jesus' heart here for his culture. He reaches out and he says, how I long to gather you under my wings and take you as my own, but you've rejected God. Jesus has compassion for the culture around him, for his city. As believers, you and I believe that Christians are called to thrive under the pressures of our culture. I believe that we truly are called to bloom wherever we are planted. The thing that's interesting about Daniel is that nowhere do we see that Daniel, rejected all of the teachings of the Babylonians. He didn't put into practice any of the evil practices, but instead he was a student of the culture. He chose to learn and grow and move up in the king's court. And I think that's important for us here today as well, to be students of the culture in which we live as well. So there's three things that I want to really quickly walk through, little insights about our culture. And really, there are three things that haven't changed in a long time. They were true in Babylon and in Daniel's day and age, and I think they're true here and now today. So three real quick things. Feel free to write them down on the back of your worship guides too. But they say this. First is that our culture is primarily concerned with itself. Would you agree? Our culture is primarily concerned with its own wants and needs and power. You see, it's dictators like Nebuchadnezzar that erect statues of themselves so that they can stay in power, right? It's part of the reason we see Darius issue decrees that no one's allowed to worship anyone but them. We see this in the Chaldeans where they're trying to trap Daniel. Our culture is obsessed with keeping itself in power. It's true for politicians. It's true for celebrities. The rulers are obsessed with staying in power. So the question for us here today as believers, in a culture that is primarily concerned with itself, are we showing them how to live with a primary concern about Jesus? In our own lives, is our primary concern about ourselves bettering who we are, or is our primary concern about Jesus and who he is and his way of living? The second thing that was true in Daniel's time that I think is true today is that our culture is very fickle. It changes its mind a lot. Have you noticed that? It can be going in one direction and then it totally switches gear and believes something completely else. I think about Daniel, right? He went from being in the king's court to being a cat's cuisine, right? From being in the highest position to being in a den of lions. That's how quickly culture changes its mind. The moment Daniel steps up, the whole culture changes against him. We see this all the time here today. We see politicians flip-flop on issues. How often have we seen celebrities fall from grace and become a laughingstock? How often have we seen businesses be quick to fire someone immediately with no plan of restoration, just leaving them by the wayside? 50, 60 years ago, right, being a Bible-believing Christian, like trying to live for the Bible, was something that culturally was still a really good thing for the most part. Now today, trying to live by the Bible's commandments, it feels controversial at best. Would you agree? It feels controversial. It feels almost like we're called ignorant at worst or bigoted. Culture changes its mind. It's a fickle thing. So for us believers, the question is this. In a world in which the culture changes its mind, are we going to be the type of people that holds firm to God's truth and God's word? In a world that changes its mind from one day to the next, will we be a people who don't in some ways? That will hold truth to that God is who he says he is, that his word is still true and can be trusted. The third thing that was true about Daniel's culture that is true today is that our culture constantly falls into its own traps. We see this with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The men were literally killed by their fire. We see it in Daniel in the lion's den. We see it with Darius, right? He puts this law into place that no one can pray to other gods, and then his man Daniel gets in trouble for it. Our culture is constantly tripping over itself and falling into its own traps. We live in a culture where it says, hey, there's no real moral or ethic for how you should behave with your body sexually. Right? Your body is your own. Do whatever you want with it, right? There's no real moral or ethic there. And then we see time and time and time after again, instances like Harvey Weinstein, Kevin Spacey, Matt Lauer. Time and time again, sexual abuse allegations are confronting these people. Time and time again, we live in a culture that says, do whatever you want with your body, right? No rhyme or reason. And it constantly falls into its own traps, and we see the byproduct of a lack of morality. We live in a culture where we say, hey, climb the corporate ladder, make as much money as you possibly can, buy as much stuff as you can, and then we wonder why we see corporate greed flourishing in America. Why we see the greed of people destroying the lives of the people that work for them. The culture falls into its own traps. And I think as believers, it's really easy for us to look at those instances and be like, ha! Told you so. I told you this would happen. This is what happens when you don't stand up for God and what's true. It's easy to shake our fists and say, you got what you deserve. But I don't think this is what Daniel did. And I don't think this is what Joseph did. And I don't think this is what Jesus did. In a culture that's constantly tripping over itself and falling into its own traps, are we going to be the type of Christians that are willing to throw down the rope into the trap, climb down into that trap, and help pull them out? Are we going to be the type of people to show compassion when we see lostness and not just anger? John 1, Jesus says, I have come full of grace and truth, full of conviction for what's right, standing up for God's word, but doing so with compassion. Does your heart break for our culture, or do you just get mad? May we be a people of compassion and conviction. Like Daniel, more concerned with winning our culture over, not just simply wiping them out. Church, we live in a time where we need less shouting louder and more modeling. Modeling who Jesus is. I want to leave you with a final quote to kind of sum up the book of Daniel a little bit. It says this: the point of Daniel, the entire book, is that all generations of readers, even here today, all generations of readers can find here a pattern and a promise. It's a pattern that human beings and their kingdoms become violent beasts when they glorify their own power, when they redefine right and wrong and don't acknowledge God as their true king.